Ibrahim Traoré was left speechless. The revelations coming out of Chad shook not only his perspective, but also that of millions across the African continent. What Chad's leader, Mahamat Idriss Déby, exposed wasn't just political drama, it was a brutal reckoning of how deeply French control had infiltrated African nations, bleeding them of their wealth and sovereignty. Chapter 1. The end of a long partnership. For decades, Chad and France maintained military agreements that allowed French troops to be stationed on Chadian soil. These agreements were framed as essential security partnerships to combat insurgencies and stabilize the region. However, the arrangement increasingly drew criticism. What was supposed to be a mutual alliance started to look more like a mechanism for France to maintain control over Chad's resources and leadership. Despite claims of providing security, insurgent attacks continued to rise. Major regions under French military surveillance remained vulnerable to raids, bombings, and kidnappings. A glaring example occurred in 2015 when bombers attacked Chad's capital, N'Djamena, killing nearly 40 people and injuring over 100, just kilometers from French military installations. This shocking incident raised a crucial question. If French forces were there to secure Chad, how could such a deadly attack happen in the heart of the capital? Things deteriorated further in 2019 when militants carried out a brutal attack on the Lake Chad region's Boma Peninsula, killing nearly 100 Chadian soldiers. This tragedy was one of the deadliest in Chad's history and occurred despite years of French military presence in the region. Such incidents exposed the growing ineffectiveness of France's so-called anti-insurgency operations, leading many Chadians to view the French troops not as protectors, but as occupiers. Public frustration boiled over into mass protests, with thousands demanding an end to the French military presence. Protesters argued that Chad needed self-sufficiency, not foreign interference, and that the continued presence of French forces only prolonged instability. The sentiment was clear: Chad had to regain control of its own security operations. This message resonated with President Mahamat Idriss Déby, who made the bold decision to expel French troops. But Déby didn't stop there. In a move that sent shockwaves across Africa, he revealed damning information about France's long-standing exploitation of Chad's resources and manipulation of its political affairs. According to Déby, France had used the guise of security to maintain a military grip on Chad and other African nations while prioritizing its own strategic interests. Chapter 2. A Regional Awakening. Chad's decision was part of a larger wave sweeping across West Africa. Neighboring countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger had already taken similar steps. In 2022, Mali became the first nation to expel France's largest military operation in Africa after years of failed counterinsurgency efforts. Burkina Faso followed in 2023, demanding the withdrawal of French troops and seeking new security partnerships with other global players, including Russia. Even Niger, long considered one of France's strongholds in the Sahel, showed signs of dissatisfaction. These countries cited broken promises and a lack of genuine security improvements as key reasons for severing ties with France. Despite France's thousands of troops and advanced surveillance capabilities, jihadist groups continued to expand their reach, destabilizing multiple nations. Instead of being weakened, these insurgent organizations grew more coordinated and emboldened, launching cross-border attacks and seizing control of entire villages. This regional shift left Chad in an increasingly precarious position. It had long been considered France's most reliable ally in Central Africa, hosting French troops for decades and serving as a strategic military hub. But with its neighbors rejecting French military influence, Chad found itself standing alone as the last major African nation still hosting French forces. The question was unavoidable: would it remain isolated, or would it follow the regional trend and reclaim its sovereignty? President Déby knew that Chad couldn't afford to be left behind. Expelling French forces wasn't just a national decision, It was about standing in solidarity with a broader African movement, but Debby's announcement went beyond just military matters. His speech challenged Western assumptions about Africa's dependence on European forces. He declared that Chad would strengthen its military on its own terms, without relying on France or other foreign powers. This was a direct rejection of the narrative that African nations were militarily weak and dependent. Deby outlined plans to modernize Chad's military, invest in defense production, and ensure that security decisions would be made in N'Djamena, not Paris. Chapter 3. The Shadow of France's Influence. For years, French military bases in Chad were not just strategic outposts for counterinsurgency, they were centers of power that ensured Chad's sovereignty remained in name only. These bases provided France with direct influence over Chad's leadership, political decisions, and economic policies. One of the most shocking revelations was France's dominance over Chad's oil industry. Oil, which should have been the backbone of Chad's economic independence, had instead become a tool for French enrichment. Deby exposed how French-owned corporations controlled the extraction of Chad's oil, exported it to Europe for refining, and then sold it on international markets at prices dictated by France. This exploitative arrangement began in the early 2000s, when Chad first commercialized its oil production. French energy giant Total Energies, backed by French political influence, secured control over key oil fields. Contracts were written to favor French interests, ensuring that the vast majority of profits flowed back to the parent companies, while Chad's government was left with only a minimal share of the revenue. One of the biggest flaws in these contracts was the lack of refining infrastructure within Chad. Instead of processing its crude oil domestically, Chad was forced to export nearly all of it to European refineries, predominantly in France. The refined petroleum products were then sold back to Chad at inflated prices set by European markets. This created a paradox where Chad, despite being an oil-rich nation, had to import fuel, gasoline, and other essential petroleum products at exorbitant costs. Deby revealed that even when Chad attempted to negotiate better terms for its oil production, it faced immense political and financial pressure. French-backed financial institutions, including the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, tied loans and development aid to continued cooperation with French oil companies. Efforts to renegotiate contracts or nationalize the oil sector were systematically blocked by France and its corporate allies. These exploitative arrangements kept Chad in a state of economic subservience. The wealth generated from its oil reserves largely flowed back to France, while the people of Chad saw minimal benefits. Deby's statements made it clear that France was not just profiting from Chad's resources, it was actively working to ensure that Chad remained dependent on a system that prioritized French interests at every level. Chapter 4. The CFA franc. Beyond the exploitation of Chad's oil resources, Deby shed light on another deeply entrenched tool of French control, the CFA franc. This currency, used by 14 African nations, including Chad, remained tied to the French treasury despite Chad gaining formal independence in 1960, created in 1945 as a colonial currency. The CFA franc was designed to keep French territories financially linked to Paris. Even after decolonization, the system persisted, allowing France to maintain direct influence over the economies of its former colonies. While supporters of the CFA franc argued that it provided monetary stability, Deby and other critics saw it as a neo-colonial tool that prevented African nations from achieving full economic sovereignty. The core issue lay in how the CFA franc was controlled. The currency was pegged to the euro, which meant that Chad could not set its own monetary policy. Additionally, CFA franc countries, including Chad, were required to store at least 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in France. This arrangement effectively placed a significant portion of Chad's wealth under French supervision, limiting the government's ability to invest freely in development projects. The consequences for Chad's economy were severe whenever France made financial decisions affecting the CFA franc. Chad had no say in the matter. One of the most devastating examples was in 1994 when France devalued the CFA franc, causing it to lose 50% of its value overnight. The impact on Chad was immediate and catastrophic, with soaring inflation, increased import costs, and widespread economic instability, because Chad relied heavily on imports for essential goods, including food, medicine, and fuel. These financial shocks disproportionately hurt the country. Déby made it clear that Chad's financial policies were still being dictated from Paris rather than N'Djamena, reinforcing the idea that France's influence was deeply embedded in the country's economy. Chapter 5. A Call for True Economic Independence. Déby's revelations extended beyond oil and currency control. He highlighted how France's financial dominance prevented Chad from pursuing independent economic policies. Trade deals, infrastructure investments, and industrial projects were all subject to French approval due to the country's financial dependence on Paris. Whenever Chad attempted to forge new economic alliances or negotiate trade agreements on its own terms, it faced pushback from France, which wielded financial leverage through international loans, aid programs, and banking regulations tied to the CFA system. This financial stranglehold ensured that France's role in Chad's economy remained dominant long after the country's formal independence. Déby's message was unequivocal. True independence could never be achieved as long as France controlled Chad's money. Breaking free from the CFA franc was just as critical as removing French troops from Chad's territory. While France framed its military presence in Chad as essential for maintaining regional security, Déby exposed the true motive: safeguarding French business interests. The military bases that were supposed to defend Chad from insurgencies ended up serving as power centers to protect and maintain France's economic dominance in the region. This arrangement had little to do with Chad's national security and everything to do with ensuring that French corporations could continue extracting resources and exerting influence over Chad's political and economic systems. By removing French forces, Chad was signaling a deeper break from a system that had long kept it subservient. The next challenge was clear. Could Chad also cut economic ties with France and survive without its financial backing? Critics, particularly from Western media and financial institutions, warned that Chad would struggle without French support. They claimed that the country's economy was too fragile, too dependent on French aid and investment, and would collapse without oversight from Paris. This narrative was one France had perpetuated for years to justify its continued influence over its former colonies, framing itself as a stabilizing force essential to their survival. But Déby wasn't buying it. He was ready with a counterplan that did not involve returning to old colonial ties or seeking Western financial assistance. Instead, he pointed to a new era of partnerships that would respect Chad's sovereignty and provide real opportunities for growth. Chapter 6. New Allies and a Strategic Pivot. The departure of French troops didn't leave Chad isolated. It opened the door for new alliances. Countries like Russia, China, Turkey, and the UAE were already lining up to strengthen trade relations and invest in Chad's future without the baggage of neocolonialism. With a track record of massive infrastructure investments across Africa, China expressed interest in funding major projects in Chad, including roads, railways, and energy facilities, projects that France had neglected despite its long presence in the country. Already working closely with Mali and Burkina Faso, Russia saw Chad as a valuable security and industrial partner, promising cooperation that would strengthen the country's military and economic sectors. As an emerging power in African diplomacy, Turkey had been expanding trade and construction projects across the continent, positioning itself as a potential key player in Chad's development. Seeing Chad as a gateway to deeper investments in Africa's resource markets, the UAE expressed interest in supporting Chad's journey toward economic independence. Instead of relying on French aid, Déby announced plans to develop local industries, invest in agriculture, and take full control of Chad's oil production. His vision was clear. Chad would no longer be a resource extraction hub for foreign companies. Chapter 7. The Dawn of a New Chad. Déby's vision for Chad was bold and transformative. He was determined to create a nation that no longer served as a financial outpost for France, but thrived as an independent economic force in Africa. Chad would trade on its own terms, build industries that benefited its people, and partner with nations that respected its sovereignty. The message was clear: Chad would no longer ask for permission to thrive. With French troops gone and a new economic plan in motion, Déby had set the stage for a brighter, self-determined future. What happens next will undoubtedly shape the country's destiny and perhaps signal the dawn of a new era for Africa itself. Do you think this is the start of a new era for Africa? Can more nations follow Chad's lead and break free from neo-colonial systems? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon to stay updated.